This was during the same time frame as the Tower of Babel. And the ancient Talmud gives us a little inkling of historical records pertaining to this that says the top was burned. Well, how can you burn a brick structure? A stone structure. They said the top was burned. The base was sunken into the sand. That's liquefaction from the earthquakes. Only the middle was left. You can go to Google Earth today, look at the old city of Babylon, view it. Now, that's the mid-kingdom. Travel a little bit south, and you'll see a moat in a square with a zizzirat, the remnants of a zizzirat in the middle of it. That was the old kingdom mentioned in the Bible right here, the Tower of Babel. And the only way that you have a moat is because the base sank into the sand. 192 later, you get the Joseph of Egypt. That's the 7-year drought and the tilting, confirmed by the Nibiru disc in Germany. 275 years later, you get the Exodus, 3 days of darkness. And because it ran into series, it slowed down, so now you have this spacing that kind of gets different here. 52 years later is Joshua's long day. 131 years later is Job's trouble. That's the same time as Ruth in the Bible. 290 years later is King David and Saul. That's where you get the Star of David. This was this object, they called it. 358 years later, you have Jonah of Nineveh giving his 40-day warning. Then you have Hezekiah's son, where the shadow is going backwards on steps. And later that evening, you have 185,000 enemy soldiers that were killed actually by meteor showers. That says in ancient texts. 352 years later, you get Hezekiah, where he said the earth was going to be shaken, where riders in the chariots were going to be cast out. This was the exact same time period when Alexander the Great was conquering Tyre. He had built that land bridge to the island, and he was trying to breach the wall, and he had trouble. It says, I think 4 to 5 meteors came. They didn't have word of them, but fiery hail came out of the sky and knocked down the wall of Tyre. That's how he was able to conquer them. That happened during the same time as Haggai. Then 362 years later, we have Yeshua's sacrifice, 3-hour eclipse. The moon's on the opposite side of Earth. The moon's not involved. And the moon can only give you 10.3 minutes of an eclipse. What gives you 3-hour eclipse? A third object. 284 years later, you have the object that Constantine saw. He claimed to be a cross, but they didn't have the cross yet. They had an X in the symbolism of Constantine. But it was our object rounding the sun coming out. It gave a star because it's a comet. It gave a star like a starburst. 395 years later, you get the Mayans and the Aztecs. The Mayans were destroyed by a severe drought. About 90% of the population died. This was the object that they paid so much. That's what they tracked throughout using their calendar. If you use the last notation, which is a Baktun, you get an exact date from Constantine in 312 to the Mayans on 707. That's exactly the period between. One Baktun. 347 years later, you run into the Chinese documenting this in 1054. And 324 years later, we have a painting in 1378 that shows 2 comets. We show a tree snapped in half. We have a meteor shower. We have buildings that are broken because of an earthquake. We have people holding their stomach because of famine. Now, some people say this is Halley's Comet. Well, Halley's Comet doesn't bring meteor showers or earthquakes or droughts. 319 years later, in 1697, we have a German wood carving that shows two major objects in the sky. One's the sun, the other one's almost equal to the size. What was it? Then we're fixing to go 319 years later. We come into Revelation. 2016 is the Jubilee. The Messiah returns on the Jubilee. This is the only common denominator that goes across this so evenly and so predictably. On the droughts, the meteor showers, the earthquakes.
So what relation, I mean, in the Bible where it mentions wormwood, what relation would that be to this
Wormwood is a meteor, a large meteor, just like a large meteor hit the Earth 150 days later, because we're going to the second debris field. Planet X is nowhere around. It's going outward into space, but we're running into the second debris field because it crosses Earth's path twice. Not once, twice. It's on the planetary plane of Earth. So we have two debris fields 150 to 152 days apart. The first one is in March. The next one is towards the end of August. End of August or beginning of September, depending on how it falls. Wormwood is a very large meteor. Wormwood is not the planet we're talking about. Wormwood is just a large meteor the size of a mountain, fiery, which just like a meteor when it's entering our atmosphere, is going to hit one of our oceans, and that's the Pacific Ocean. And it will hit us so hard that every wall is cracked. The Earth is somewhat split. That means lava's coming because the ring of fire is moved. It's pouring out lava. The Earth will wobble like a drunkard, and our calendar year is going to be changed. We're going to be pushed inward by waves. That's Enoch's calendar, 365 days a year. That's why we won't know the day or the hour. We know that it's September, beginning of the Hebrew month of Tishri, I think. But living during this time, we won't know it because our calendar year has changed. We can count on the calendar today, but it's not going to be the real date when we get into it.
Well, that explains a lot about not knowing the day or the hour.
You see, that day, let me get the correct saying because I'm a little rusty here. That day that's most... See, remember, this is written by Hebrews in a Hebrew culture that knows certain things that we don't know. The Day of Trumpet, which is the first of Tishri, you have to witness the new moon. That's the only feast day that begins the beginning of a month. Therefore, it is known in the Hebrews. No man knows the day or the hour until it's witnessed. Got it? It's known as that day. Because if you read the next passage above that, he says, "For I have no need to tell you because you already know, because it is the day that no man knows the day or the hour." He told, it's like if I told you, I'm going to arrive at your house on Turkey Day. You'd know without me saying what day that would be. Well, that's what he just said. He told them the day. But we will not know when we start to live in this period literally, because our year has changed. So it's a double innuendo.
Oh,
you know what I'm saying?
So you go back, the calendar will end up going back to the way that it was before?
No, that was 360. Enoch calendar talks, which has never been there's no place in the world as a calendar year ever been documented as 365-day year. It was documented globally 360 and 365. And a and a quarter days. Let me see. That would be, 300. I'm sorry. Enoch's calendar, 364 days. It's a day shorter. Okay? So, so that's, remember, Enoch, he was given seven visions of the future. So this is a future event that we're going to literally have a 364-day year coming up. And that makes sense because the meteor shower in the end of August is not coming from the sun. That's coming from outward, going towards the sun. So it hits us on the nighttime side of Earth. The meteor showers in April or March comes from the daylight side of Earth. Remember how the object comes in and goes around the sun and leaves. So you have two different directions of debris.
Right. So have you kind of mapped out where you think, like maybe Mexico or around that area where you think there might be an impact?
No, it's probably going to be the ocean. This large America would be out. North and South America would be wiped out by small meteors. You know, I'm saying small because they're not the size of a mountain, like this one's described. This one's big enough to move Earth into a different orbit. It's going to push us closer to the sun slightly. Therefore, we have a shorter distance to go around the sun, giving us a shorter year. 364 days a year. That's what happened to Hezekiah's time. We were dragged outward slightly. Our calendar year globally in every culture changed from 360, 365 and a quarter days.
Okay.
Now we have an object that explains why it happened. Because you can't say they just didn't know how to count. That's wrong. They have ancient observatories. Okay? They know when the equinox is from year to year because they need to know that for planting and harvesting. Without that, a town would starve. So they kept count. They knew how to count. They knew exactly how long. That's why globally, either that or no one in the world knew how to count. Which one? Does that make sense? No one in the world knew how to count? That's why we have 360-day year? I don't think so. Because within about 5 years, you miss your growing season. You have people starving because they put their seed in the ground at the wrong time. That's why you have ancient observatories to find out when the equinoxes were. Winter's over with.
I have a person who's listening, and they are asking about a Psalms 83 war and these things that have been that they've read about having to happen before these events would occur. How would you answer that?
There's a war mentioned in Seal 4, which is not the end war, which is after the end of the peace agreement, because if you read carefully, Seal 5 used to bother me. Why would the Almighty even write a paragraph or a chapter on people complaining to Him? What would be the sense to that? And what it was is that they're complaining to God because they have not been revenged, and they see a peace agreement being written on earth. They say, "Where is our pound of flesh?" He says, "It's not your time yet. Go back to fleet." Seal 5 is a signal to us when the peace agreement is being signed on earth, viewed from heaven. All right? There's a war before the peace agreement. That's why you have to have a peace agreement. You need a peace agreement after you have a war, logically. Correct?
Right.
So after the peace agreement, the agreement's for 7 years, but he breaks it midway. That is the big battle. There is a battle in when Hezekiah is talking about the battle that's coming up right now. You're going to have a battle with right now. ISIS. Everybody's worried. ISIS has rockets now, large rockets. If they get their hands on that chemical weapon supply that Saddam and them brought into Syria and buried, if they put chemical weapons on those rockets and fire it to Israel, that's a mass destructive weapon they just used against Israel. Israel has clear rights to defend herself with its own mass destructive weapon, which would be nuclear. It says in the Bible, it says a scroll, it says like a evil woman was put into a lead container. Well, the Hebrew word for evil fire or woman is also fire, like radiation. Put into lead, and that scroll is a cylinder flying through the air. That's a cruise missile or a rocket, pretty much. Matter of fact, it gives very close dimensions to the rockets that Iran has right now, if you use the cubit measurements that they're giving. And if ISIS launches this against Israel, that will start this next war. And Israel will have to defend itself. Damascus will be a ruinous heap, and they will not stop there. They will stop. They will also take care of the people who are providing them the rockets, which is Iran. And they'll take care of that nuclear facility. Where that nuclear facility is, I forgot the name of that territory. There's an ancient name for it. It's not Persia. There's another area on the side of Persia that's named. It says no one will live there for 1,000 years, along the Persian Gulf region right there, where they got that nuclear facility. Radiation would give a good reason why nobody would live there for 1,000 years.
So when this what I've noticed is a lot of people are kind of are reading about the seals because they know that we've got to be, somewhere close. And I get a lot of questions about the timing and where do we think that where they ask us, where do you think we are in the seals?
You have to know the Hebrew customs and feasts, what we call feasts, which are actually, the word is mikraz, they're rehearsals, actually. That's the wrong word to call them feast. A feast can be in a rehearsal, but what you're doing is you're doing a practice run for something that God is warning you about or preparing you for. This is a Shemitah we're in right now. You're supposed to, the rich who own land prepared 1 year of food before the end of the 6th year. The poor prepares their food at the beginning, the first half of the Shemitah. They're allowed to go in the field and harvest and store up food. Biblically, you're supposed to put aside 1 year of food right now and get rid of your debts. Debts are supposed to be canceled. And guess what? If you follow the seals with that, the next seal to go is seal 3, economic collapse. You can read this in the news where Greece is in trouble. Italy and Spain are fixing to fall with them. The euro will collapse. The dollar will also collapse shortly after. You got 6 major countries that's forming they're backing their country a currency with natural resources, which is called the Basel III Agreement that they've agreed to. 192 international banks approved the Basel III Agreement. By this September, you're going to have Basel certified banks opening up to be able to handle this, because now a currency is backed with only 6 currencies or 6 countries are going to have their currency back. One of them is China, Russia, Venezuela, South Africa, India, and Iraq. Iraq is the only one that's artificially depressed. Before these countries can be released, the Iraqi dinar has to go up to normal market, which would be at least equal to the dollar. It'll go beyond that because of our debt ceilings. It was worth $3 more. I mean, before the war, it took $3 American to buy one Iraqi dollar. That's before the trillions of dollars of debt between our last 2 presidents. Between Bush and Mr. Obama, they had trillions of dollars of debt. It's worth at least 6 now if it goes to a normal market. So you're looking at a huge, now that happens, that's CO3, economic collapse. CO4 would be the war. 5 is a peace agreement.
Would you be expecting this to happen, the steel to be broken quickly? I mean, one after another? Because a lot of people I'm getting emails, they're saying there has to be so many years in between each one. I don't know where they're getting this. They're reading, the Psalms and the different, explanations of Revelation that actually occur earlier in the Bible.
The best thing that they need to do right now is grab a hold of a better understanding of the Hebrew customs and ways. It's not taught in Christian circles. He gave these clues to the Hebrews. They're not something we were supposed to give up. These are rehearsals for a specific reason. It gets you prepared. If people are not willing to follow the Shemitah, guess what's going to happen when economic collapse happens? You're going to stand in line waiting for food issued to you by Homeland Security during the time that CO4 says there's plague and epidemics. It's plural. Pandemic disease is plural. War and famine. So if you want to stand in line waiting for food during a pandemic crisis, or do you want to stay at home having a year's supply of food where you don't have to go out? That's their decision. But you can't say the Almighty didn't warn them. He has. They're just not listening.
Yeah, what I've heard a lot with the Christian churches and the Christians that I've met, there are many of them that cannot afford to put away a year's worth of food, and that they barely are able to get by as it is. So a lot of these people are just relying on when Jesus said, "Don't worry about where you sleep and what you're going to eat," just
Christians right now should invest a few $100s in some dinars. Either that or buy some gold if you wish. I think gold is too finely controlled. You can't leave the country with it. But dinars is a currency. You're going to do a currency exchange when one goes up, one is going down. I think within the next month to the month and a half, you're going to see the dinar go up. You may get about 7,000 return on that. For every $1 that you invest, you might get up to about 7,000. I think it'll take about $6 American to buy one Iraqi dinar, and that's before the dollar collapses. So now you can take that gain you had, pay off your bills, and buy your supplies. He's not leaving his poor, and then you bless the ones who want to follow the Shemitah. You bless them with food and supplies. His people will be taken care of, but it's only by the ones who are following his instructions. These Mekras are not feasts like to have a party and have a meal. No, they're rehearsal patterns for a real event. You're in it. you're in the Shemitah, you're fixing to get a real big dose of a real event, that is economic collapse, followed by war and pandemic diseases. You're going to have, when that war starts in the Middle East, these jihadists throughout the West are going to go into action. It's going to disrupt our utilities. You're going to have cyber attacks. The Internet's going to go down, and you won't be able to reach this information that I'm giving you. You have to have this in your head and knowledge right now and know what to do. Then when you see this sign in the heavens, around the 40-day warning or so, between there and somewhere around March 8th of 2016, if we see this sign, remember, this has to be qualified as seeing a sign in the heaven. We know what we're looking for now. It's the sign of Jonah. This is this object. That marks that this next year is a Jubilee. Elijah, matter of fact, it's known in the Hebrew customs that the Messiah returns on a Jubilee. And he does, and keep in mind the Bible does not specifically say he only returns once more time. It's more than once. He returns at the beginning of the Great Tribulation, and he returns at the end of the Great Tribulation. At the beginning, he's only picking up the bride, and he says it's a remnant. That's not the entire church. That's a subset. And he brings you to the wilderness. Well, wilderness has never been qualified as heaven. But he's bringing you to a place in the wilderness as a place of safety for his remnant, the chosen one, the ones who are in Jerusalem at this time following the Mekrah, because of Passover, you're required to show up in Jerusalem. That's where the two prophets are going to show up. Elijah is going to show up for the Feast of Passover. That's the 15th. He will announce the groom is coming. The groom will return mid of week, mid of night. Exactly on the date given in Revelation 12:1 is exactly 3.5 days after the full moon, after Feast of Passover. How did they know this 2,000 years ago? They can't be that accurate. Then the Messiah will show up for his remnant. Opposite side of earth during that time is being hit by a meteor shower. The ones who are on the dark side, remember it's nighttime, he's taking them and he's bringing them to a place of safety. Two groups. You have the bride, which is 144,000, which is only Israelites, as it's stated, with their family members. Only the males are counted as a family unit. So you're looking at, you multiply that times 3.5, the bride consists of about 500,000. Then you have the bridesmaids. Remember the wise and the foolish virgins? Well, the word virgin in Hebrew would have been maiden. They're the bridesmaid. But only the wise make it. Why? Because the wise have 2 portions of oil, not 1 portion. The foolish have 1 portion. When their first oil is used up and burned, they trim their wicks and they refill their lamps with their second portion. A portion is supposed to last you through 12 hours of nighttime. This night is 24 hours because Earth's rotation has slowed down by 12 hours. We have 12 hours of daylight on this side. Jerusalem has 12 hours of nighttime. So the wise have 2 portions of oil. So when they're refilling, the foolish come in and ask them, can you give us all? I said, no, there's not enough. They have to go back to town. So as they're finished trimming and lighting their lamp, Yeshua returns mid of night, not midnight. Midnight is a modern term. Mid of night means mid of the night. They just finished burning 12 hours of oil, so that's mid of night. And they just replenished. Now they're leaving with the groom, the bride and the bridesmaid. The bridesmaid lights because there's no street. There is no street lights in the ancient Hebrew wedding. So you need the lamps to light the way for the bride and the groom. So the bridesmaids are carrying the lamps. And they go into this place of safety in the wilderness, where they're there for 3.5 years being fed manna and learning the proper scriptures. Then, in September, on the day that no man knows hour, is the resurrection. The dead are first. Remember, the two prophets are dead now. They're the first of the resurrected with the other dead. That's the guests to the wedding. Then the living, which is part of the bridemaid, enters second. And then the bride. The bride enters last. The least are first and the most are last. That's the least knowledge and the most knowledge. He said, my people perish for the lack of knowledge. Then a Hebrew groom cannot go to war after 1 year of marriage. So that feast in heaven is for 1 year, while the Antichrist has the 7 bowl judgments on it. Then when he leaves, he defeats the Antichrist. He goes back to heaven. Now he tells the guests of the wedding, it's time for you to go back to earth. That's the gnashing of teeth. They don't want to leave heaven. But he's telling them, the wedding's over with. You're the guest of the wedding. You go back to earth and take 7 years to clean up the implements of war, to burn the implements of war. The guests make up the nation of the earth. The bridemaid and the bridemaid live in the New Jerusalem, and they govern the nations that are on earth for the next 1,000 years. They will have to follow the mikras and the laws that they've forsaken during 1,000 years.
So who whenever people talk about the remnant, which we hear, we hear a lot about that on more of the alternative media, and they're talking about the remnant, the chosen ones, or the part of people that are considered the remnant. Who exactly are you saying that will be?
Well, I can qualify because the Bible qualifies it. It says the 144,000 are Israelites. Okay?
Okay.
If you add their family members to it, that's about 500,000 people that make up the bride. The bridemaid, that number 5 is not a random number. It's 5 times the bride. You're looking at about 2.5 million, but they're from any tribe. The bridemaid is from any tribe. So you're looking, and then there's the foolish is also 5, another 2.5, but they're foolish. They don't know the timing right, and they'll have to stay behind a little while, which they're thrown into prison for about 10 days before their head is cut off. Now, they have a special place in the New Jerusalem, too, because they would not take the mark. You see?
So the second group are the people that you're directing at, the people who are at this present time, as this stuff is going on, are the people who are looking up and doing the work that they're trying to get the word out. We hear a lot of people talk about that, and like Scott and I both said, that we just can't worry about what is going to happen or where we are all the time. We have to worry about reaching people, because we have a lot of people that call us and are desperate for help, and we have to keep our eyes on trying to help these people. So like he said, a lot of people say, well, I'm a pre-tribber, and then I'm a post-tribber, and then somebody says I'm a pan-trib. It'll all pan out. So the second group of people that you are referring to are those people, the people that are keeping their lamps lit and watching for him.
And following his mikras as he instructed them to, will recognize. Remember, if you're celebrating Passover properly, you're in Jerusalem. And when Elijah, it says in there, Elijah is going to be Moses, the other one, is going to show up in Jerusalem. They're not showing up in Paris or New York or Sydney, Australia. They're only showing up in Jerusalem. Now, if you want to see the miracles that the two prophets will make and speak to them, you need to be in Jerusalem. Remember when the Messiah came and sacrificed? We didn't see him if we were in New York or Sydney or Paris. You had to be in Jerusalem to see him being sacrificed. because the Mekrah was specifically set for Jerusalem. The rehearsal pattern was specifically set for Jerusalem. This pattern is also set for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be the only safe, or the main safe area. It's going to be the Middle East, Persian area. It's going to be the pivot point of the tilt. That's the only safe place on earth during this time period whenever this planet passes. Now, Jerusalem is the only place that you're going to meet the two witnesses, and the only place you're going to meet the Messiah when he comes. Because he says, if you read Job 2, Job 2, starting with verse 30, all the way to 32. 30 gives you the time frame. This is the end times that it's basically telling us. 31 tells you that's basically planet 7X. The sun is darkened and the moon. You can't have a double eclipse. Verse 31 tells you where to be. 32. It says, on Mount Zion in Jerusalem you shall be an escape, as Yehovah has said. And amongst it says survivor, but that word can also mean remnant, whom Yehovah calls. When he calls you out, come out of her, my people, which is going to be following his Mekrah. When you see the sign of Jonah, which is in the heavens, you got to literally see a literal sign in the heavens, which is this planet. You make your way to Jerusalem. He says that more than once in there. So no one has an excuse unless they wish to deny his word and not follow it. Then they got the proper consequences for it. The rapture, taking away in an instant anywhere in the world, is 3.5 years later. The dead are first, then the living. That happens in September. You know, we're talking about March, when Passover, the Feast of Passover, when Elijah announces the groom is coming. It's always been known that to the Hebrew, he will come on the Feast of Passover. That's always been March or April, not September. Now, if you go 3.5 years, that perfectly fits. 3.5 years later, you got a beginning of a March and an end of a September. If you turn them around, it doesn't work.
So basically, the people that I'm getting more questions. The people that are on the rest of the planet that just physically cannot go to Jerusalem will just have to wait.
The same issues were also there when they were exiting Egypt. If you add up the numbers of the bride and the bridemaid, it equals out to the same amount of people that left Egypt. 2 to 3 million people was what's estimated as the Passover or the Exodus of Egypt. Did they not have elderly and invalid?
Yeah.
Read the text carefully. They traveled for 3 days and nights. The animals, the elderly, everyone. That's a miracle. Because they were revitalized. They felt like they were 20. Even the animals didn't get tired. They traveled day and night for 3 days. They weren't worn out. Remember the two prophets. The two prophets are they're going to produce miracles. If someone has a cut leg, a amputated leg or arm, and they in front of those two prophets, you're going to see them. You're going to see that limb grow back. You're not going to see someone faking, pushing someone down, and say this is a miracle, and he pushes them down with their hand. No. You're going to see real miracles. You're going to see healings and limbs growing back, organs going back. These people will feel like they're 20-something again, in their 20s. After the feast, you follow the book of Esther. After the feast, you fast for 3 to 3.5 days. And it says that he revitalized you on that last day. You better go anywhere that he says to go. And keeping in mind, Seal 4, remember Hitler? What was the first thing? Let me walk you through. This is almost the same scenario. Remember Hitler, he got the brown shirts to vote him in. He told them how good he was going to be as their president and prop up the country and everything. Then he created, once he was in power, he created the Nazis. Then he changed his agenda to a war. That angered the brown shirts that got him in. Then he created what's called the Night of the Long Knives. He sent the Nazis and eliminated the opposition. And what did Hitler do after that? He took anyone that was a burden to the state and annihilated them. The handicapped, the retarded, they all started disappearing. When we have economic collapse here, you got all these FEMA camps, and the elderly can't stand in line for their own food. We're going to have problems. If they're not prepared ahead of time, when the dinar goes up, that's the only thing I can see that can actually help Christians help others. This is not to boost your 401k plan. Forget it. You use part of that money to help people who want to follow the Mekras, that want to be in Jerusalem to meet the Messiah when he comes, to meet the two prophets. Otherwise, remember how it says that he takes a group of people and he refines them like silver and gold through a furnace?
Yeah.
The word refine means to make better. He's not going to make better the evil ones. He's making better part of the church that's not following his Mekras and his commandments.
So what's next? Well, go ahead.
What? Remember Abraham? The Bible says in the end time the whole world is Babylon. What did Abraham do? He walked out of Babylon. Abraham was not born a Hebrew. It was his actions that defined him as Hebrew. Hebrew means to step out of, to walk out of. Any one of us can be Hebrew if we step out of the system, the Babylonian system. Then we become Hebrew. We may or may not be Israelites because that's a bloodline. But we can be Hebrew because we follow an action. He's telling us ahead of time, the whole world is Babylon.
So how do you see this relating to the Jade Helm, the Jade Helm plans that they have here in the United States?
They have to, you can ask any military advisor or any person in the military. You exercise on ground similar to a real exercise.
Yes.
There is no other reason why they're on our turf, because there's going to be a real event on our turf. They're preparing for economic collapse. There's some talk about a meteor coming in September. I don't see it in the Bible, but it wouldn't surprise me where they make a false one and create some sort of emergency to where Homeland Security has to be implemented. And they're going to come in as your friend, winning hearts and minds to get established. After CO 6, the meteor shower that it's talking about, they won't be your friends then, because it's going to be a terrible place on earth. The Bible tells us this is going to be the worst event in Earth's history. That's a pretty bold statement.
So at that point, if you haven't immigrated to Jerusalem, you're just going to have to stay and stick it out.
You have to be there for Seal 6. You don't have to be there before that. Matter of fact, it almost tells you not to. It says, don't make your trip in the winter or the Sabbath. Well, that Sabbath I thought used to be the weekly Sabbath, but now I believe it to be the yearly Sabbath. We're in the Sabbath year right now. So, because during the peace agreement, put it this way, I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot tell the future. I can tell you what the astronomy tells me of what Revelation 12:1 says. He is actually literally giving us a date using astronomical. Remember he said the stars and the planets and moons were for dates and seasons?
Yes.
Well, that lineup is a date. That's March 26, 2016. Now, can I say that is going to be the date that the Messiah returns? I can't say that. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm saying that it greatly concerns me because it lines up with everything. Well, if that's when the Messiah returns, that's also the same time as Seal 6, the meteor shower and opposite. That means before that date happens, you have to have Seal 5, 4, and 3 happen. Well, if we back up using Daniel's numbers, that gives us a peace agreement happening around January 11th. And a 40-day warning happens somewhere around February, to get you the exact dates. And remember, these are estimates because unless we see a sign in heaven, we don't know. We have to confirm all this from what we see in heaven. So at the 40-day mark, that would be around February, I believe. Let's see, February. I'm having trouble finding the information here. Well, we'll have to skip it. I'll get it later. And therefore, around September, I'm kind of expecting Seal 4 to happen: war, pandemic, disease, famine. But before that, before Seal 4, Seal 3, that's economic collapse. If you wait to, which is the next seal, if you wait till economic collapse, then you cannot prepare food or any supplies for, or any of this. You have to rely on practicing the mikras, the rehearsal patterns. That's the key to this.
Scott, where are you at on this?
Well, I think the information that he's giving is definitely something we need to digest. And a lot of us aren't familiar with some of the Hebrew traditions and laws, even though it may be in Scripture. What I'd like to do on ending this out, we've got about 15 minutes, is, Gil, that you're talking about 2016, that this Planet X could potentially be coming back. Can you give us an idea what we're going to see? Because I noticed that you mentioned the Gulf of Mexico. There was an impact there with a crater. And then you talked about earthquakes, volcanoes, and weather changes, and the sea levels rising. Could you kind of close out about what's really going to happen here when this thing comes into range?
Okay. Pertaining to the Gulf of Mexico is the world's largest crater. One of the reasons why scientists really have a tough time accepting that is because when you deal with craters that large, there's two levels of heat that are generated from the impact. One from the blast, and one a frequency that vibrates all carbon molecules so violently that they spontaneously combust. And you have a ring of fire that goes all the way around the earth. You have a burnt cinder with no life. But all of that is canceled out if the impact happened during the second event of Noah's flood, when the earth was flooded. With the water, it cancels out the heat issue and the frequency. And it knocked off 71% of our continental crust. That's why you had Pangea. Pangea was forced there because you had 71% additional crust. When the crust was removed, then Pangea could break up and form the continents as we see it today. You can look at Florida. If you look at Florida close, you see a lake is cut in half. And there's a double rim. You can see the second rim off the coast of Florida. Well, that rim goes about half of our state of Louisiana, and the lower half of our state is from Mississippi silt, including the coastline of Texas. That's where the silt goes and fills in. And we're sliding south and downward on a 45-degree slope. We have offshore platforms that the plus 10, where the dock facility where a boat would come up to offload the crew, was underwater. They had to raise it like 12 feet because the shelf is sliding. Slowly, but sliding. I felt about 3 nights ago, for the first time, an earthquake over here. That was 4:30 in the morning. And they didn't even mark it. I was talking to a gentleman at Fort Worth. He said that they had an earthquake. I said, what time was it? Around 4:30 that same day. I felt it. We're not supposed to feel earthquakes because we're not on a rock base. We're sediment. It usually absorbs it. Something happened for me to feel that. And the data points that are given in the Bible and the Chinese records and all these other points, the stories of the Bible are not random. The data is preparing us for what to expect in Revelation. And the sequence of events follows the scientific model that is described in Revelation. And that's pretty incredible for 2,000 years ago, when they didn't have the science of how planets are orbiting or Kepler's law of the planetary motion, any of this. Even the Chinese didn't have that. But yet the model follows Kepler's law of the planetary motion when they're viewed and where. So as this object approaches, first you see it as a comet, then it'll go behind the sun. When it pops out, the tail will be pointing opposite side, because the tail always points opposite of the sun. It will probably look larger than Jupiter does at night when it's that far away. And every time it gets half the distance between us, it doubles in our visual perspective. So it's roughly, let me see here, roughly at 40 days away. When it gets to 20, it will double in size. When it gets where it's about 7 days away, it will be about 50% of the size of the moon. When it's 2 days away, it will be about 3.4 times the diameter of the moon. And then when it's right to the side of us, it could be anywhere from 50 to 80 times the size of the moon when it's crossing Earth's path, because it's going to pass in between the moon and the Earth. When it gets between us and the sun, that causes the moon and and the sun to be darkened. At the same time, the tail is pointing at Earth. Earth slowly enters into the magnetic, into the plasma tail. It'll take 24 to 28 hours for it to get fully into the center of the plasma tail. Each hour that it goes in, it's losing 4.5 to 5.5% of the energy that's causing it to rotate. The speed of its rotation will slow down. So you get a compound, and it'll be compounded every hour, another 4.5%. So you get, when you're looking at 24 to 28 hours later, Earth comes to a complete stop, just like the time of Jonah. I mean, the long day of Joshua. About 6 hours before it's ready to cross Earth's path is where the magnetic fields start to attract, and Earth's tilt will start. We will start to tilt. It will take about 6 hours for this tilt to happen. That's when the high winds are happening, anywhere from 150 to 300 miles an hour. Now, when Earth stops rotating, there's a bulge of water near the equator, which is called by centrifugal force. Well, that centrifugal force stops also, and your water will start to gravitate more to the north and south pole. So you have less water near the equator and coastal flooding hundreds of miles in, north and south of the equator. As it's tilting with anywhere from 150 to 300 mile an hour wind. The safe place to be would be at this tilt, which is going to be around Jerusalem. Now, as we're in this plasma tail, that's exciting the northern and southern lights. The aurora is going to come all the way down to the equator. And it's going to have massive colors because we're in very thick plasma. The plasma is going to be super excited, so it's going to howl like a trumpet. And the Earth is going to vibrate because it's coming to a complete stop as it's tilting. And when it gets close to us, when it's at our point of crossing our path, you have electrical discharges between the two planets. You have lightning between 2 to 3 kilometers wide crossing between the two planets, Earth and planet 7X. Remember the mythological stories about Zeus throwing lightning bolts and melting mountains?
Yes.
Well, part of that is myth and part of that is factual. The myth is the name. The factual point was this was the planet they called Zeus or Jupiter. And there was lightning bolts tossed at that time. And then as it's moving away from us, about 2 to 3 hours later, Earth is partly correcting its tilt, and that's when it goes into the meteor shower. The meteor shower lasts roughly about 1 hour. Earth travels in its orbit about 8.4 Earth diameters in 1 hour. But because of the angle that planet 7X is crossing us, that is equivalent to 7 times the diameter of Earth, and that happens within 1 hour. As the Bible says, your doom comes within 1 hour. And the tail now, the plasma tail, is now pointing to Virgo, illuminating only Virgo in the night skies looking from Jerusalem, which is the sign that's given in Revelation 12:1. And this is when the Messiah comes for his bride and the bridemaid. As the meteor shower is happening on the other side, he's removing us and bringing us. Everyone else is underground asking rocks to cover them. Only his people who know the scripture well enough is above ground, waiting for him.
I want to just intervene here. We're down to just a few seconds. Gil, thank you. This is information that has and brought me to a new level of understanding the end. And I wanted everyone to know that his information is on my website at scotthensler.org. Gil, thank you. And so we'd like to have you back sometime. Would that work for you?
Sure, that'd be fine. And the book is free. They can download this and get all this information, and they can look up the scripture as I state where the scripture is found for all of these incidents.
All right. Again, thank you, Gil. Anyways, Julie, is there anything we're going to go? We've already gone into the third hour, so we're okay. But Julie, just anything you'd like to say before we go?
I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming on.
Well, thank you for your question, Julie. And if you have any additional questions, you can call me up, and we can have a one-on-one question and answer series. And that way, if people contact you, you can have some answers for them. And you can do the math yourself.
They've been doing it, contacting me all throughout the show by email and asking me questions. So that's great. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. God bless you guys, and good night.
Bible. 290 years later is King David and Saul. That's where you get the Star of David. This was this object, they called it. 358 years later, you have Jonah of Nineveh giving his 40-day warning. Then you have Hezekiah's son, where the shadow is going backwards on steps. And later that evening, you have 185,000 enemy soldiers that were killed actually by meteor showers. That says in ancient texts. 352 years later, you get Hezekiah, where he said the earth was going to be shaken, where riders in the chariots were going to be cast out. This was the exact same time period when Alexander the Great was conquering Tyre. He had built that land bridge to the island, and he was trying to breach the wall, and he had trouble. It says, I think 4 to 5 meteors came. They didn't have word of them, but fiery hail came out of the sky and knocked down the wall of Tyre. That's how he was able to conquer it. That happened during the same time as Haggai. Then 362 years later, we have Yeshua's sacrifice, 3-hour eclipse. The moon's on the opposite side of Earth. The moon's not involved. And the moon can only give you 10.3 minutes of an eclipse. What gives you 3-hour eclipse? A third object. 284 years, Wormwood is not the planet we're talking about. Wormwood is just a large meteor the size of a mountain, fiery, which just like a meteor when it's entering our atmosphere, is going to hit one of our oceans, and that's the Pacific Ocean. And it will hit us so hard that every wall is cracked. The earth is somewhat split. That means lava's coming because the ring of fire is moved. It's pouring out lava. The earth will wobble like a drunkard, and our calendar year is going to be changed. We're going to be pushed inward by waves. That's Enoch's calendar, 365 days a year. That's why we won't know the day or the hour. We know that it's September, beginning of the Hebrew month of Tishri, I think. But living during this time, we won't know it because our calendar year has changed. We can count on the calendar today, but it's not going to be the real date when we get into it.
Well, that explains a lot about not knowing the day or the hour.
You see, that day, let me get the correct saying because I'm a little rusty here. That day that's most See, remember, this is written by Hebrews in a Hebrew culture that knows certain things that we don't know. The day of trumpet, which is the first of Tishri, you have to witness the new moon bring meteor showers or earthquakes or droughts. 319 years later, in 1697, we have a German wood carving that shows two major objects in the sky. One's the sun, the other one's almost equal to the size. What was it? Then we're fixing to go 319 years later. We come into Revelation. 2016 is the Jubilee. The Messiah returns on the Jubilee. This is the only common denominator that goes across this so evenly and so predictably. On the droughts, the meteor showers, the earthquakes.
So what relation, I mean, in the Bible where it mentions wormwood, what relation would that be to this
Wormwood
event?
Wormwood is a meteor, a large meteor, just like a large meteor hit the Earth 150 days later, because we're going to the second debris field. Planet X is nowhere around. It's going outward into space. But we're running into the second debris field because it crosses Earth's path twice. Not once, twice. It's on the planetary plane of Earth. So we have two debris fields 150 to 152 days apart. The first one is in March. The next one is towards the end of August. End of August or beginning of September, depending on how it falls. Wormwood is a very large meteor. Because later you have the object that Constantine saw. He claimed to be a cross, but they didn't have the cross yet. They had an X in the symbolism of Constantine. But it was our object rounding the sun coming out. It gave a star because it's a comet. It gave a star like a starburst. 395 years later, you get the Mayans and the Aztecs. The Mayans were destroyed by a severe drought. About 90% of the population died. This was the object that they paid so much. That's what they tracked throughout using their calendar. If you use the last notation, which is a Baktun, you get an exact date from Constantine in 312 to the Mayans on 707. That's exactly the period between. One Baktun. 347 years later, you run into the Chinese documenting this in 1054. And 324 years later, we have a painting in 1378 that shows two comets. We show a tree snapped in half. We have a meteor shower. We have buildings that are broken because of an earthquake. We have people holding their stomach because of famine. Now, some people say this is Halley's Comet. Well, Halley's Comet doesn't. This was during the same time frame as the Tower of Babel. And the ancient Talmud gives us a little inkling of historical records pertaining to this that says the top was burned. Well, how can you burn a brick structure? A stone structure. They said the top was burned. The base was sunken into the sand. That's liquefaction from the earthquakes. Only the middle was left. You can go to Google Earth today, look at the old city of Babylon, view it. Now, that's the mid-kingdom. Travel a little bit south, and you see a moat in a square with a zizzirat, the remnants of a zizzirat in the middle of it. That was the old kingdom mentioned in the Bible right here, the Tower of Babel. And the only way that you have a moat is because the base sank into the sand. 192 later, you get the Joseph of Egypt. That's the 7-year drought and the tilting. confirmed by the Nibiru disc in Germany. 275 years later, you get the Exodus, 3 days of darkness. And because it ran into series, it slowed down, so now you have this spacing that kind of gets different here. 52 years later is Joshua's long day. 131 years later is Job's trouble. That's the same time as Ruth in the Bible.